Sympathy for a Tragic Hero. Written by Elena Finway. Read by Arashi. Kid Ferdinand is visiting the Middle Franc Opera House in Enbar for the first time. At first, he isn't really into the visit, but his father insists upon it because he intends to introduce his son to the high society, and with that, to the future conspirators against the emperor. The conspirator meeting is happening in the background, while Ferdinand watches the act on the stage and is enchanted by Manuela's singing and swordplay. This invokes his love for weaponry, and he starts to value noble standards far more than before. Ferdinand thought theater was stupid. He decided as much that morning while the servants dressed him up. His father had insisted he put on his full regalia, including a stiff collar and tight tie. He hated the full regalia. It was so terribly uncomfortable that Ferdinand felt like he could barely breathe in it, not to mention how constricting the stiff clothing was, and he was only allowed to move in a very specific way. Running, for example, was strictly forbidden. Father claimed it was not proper for a nobleman. Ferdinand was 5 and knew exactly how the world was supposed to work. Sitting still and watching people do things on a stage was definitely not on the list of things he had to do. Unfortunately, Dad saw it differently. He had said something about introducing himself to society and showing himself. Ferdinand hadn't really understood what that had to do with theater. His nanny had explained to him that, in theater, people dressed up and pretended to be someone else to tell a story. Ferdinand would much rather play knights and princesses with his friends than watch others do it, and Ferdinand didn't understand what all this had to do with showing off, as his father had said. Now he trailed behind his father as they made their way to their seats in the theater, making a face because he would much rather have been playing with his tin soldiers than pushing his way between all the finely dressed gentlemen. Most of them only saw his father, and not the little boy who was following him, so Ferdinand was often bumped into. At least, it was a small consolation for him that he had his own gallery with his father. There were only a handful of other chairs here. "Ah, Dugayer, good to see you." A tall, dark-eyed man greeted them with these words, and approached his father to welcome him with a handshake. "Lord Arundel, punctual as ever," replied father, pushing Ferdinand forwards. "May I present my son and heir, Ferdinand. Ferdinand, please bow." Ferdinand reluctantly complied. He wanted to get away from his father and out of the stranger's sight. Lord Arundel got down on his knees so that he could see Ferdinand better. "Hello, little one. You're the spitting image of your father. I'm sure you'll make him proud." Not knowing how to respond, Ferdinand just nodded silently. His father laughed. "He's a clever, bright boy who learns with diligence. I'm sure he'll grow into his heritage quickly." Lord Arundel ruffled Ferdinand's hair, which Ferdinand acknowledged with a pout. He was no longer a baby. Lord Arundel laughed. "In any case, he already has a mind of his own. But enough about the boy. Are the others coming too?" The conversation turned in a different direction, and Ferdinand sensed his chance to escape his father. He scurried past the 2 men to the front of the gallery barrier. He stood on tiptoe and stretched until he could finally get a glimpse over the parapet. It wasn't much, though. He mainly saw a large curtain, the opposite galleries, and part of the auditorium below them. Numerous people were crowded there, looking for their seats. Before Ferdinand got round to marveling at the many different costumes, something else caught his attention. "Dad, what's that?" Ferdinand pointed to a footbridge that led through the auditorium to the stage. "Ferdinand, don't climb. You'll fall off," said his father, stepping up to him and putting an arm around him. "It's called Hanamichi." "I see," said Ferdinand, wondering if he knew the word. What's that?" Father, who had already turned his attention back to Lord Arundel, sighed. "The second stage. The main actor comes on stage across it. You'll see that in a moment." "I hear Manuela Casagranda is playing the leading role in this play," Lord Arundel interjected. "The rising star of the Middle Franc Opera Company. I've heard good things about her." "Who is she?" asked Ferdinand. Lord Arundel answered this question with a smile. "Curious, little boy. She's an actress, and very popular. In a few years, you might understand why." "I see." Ferdinand looked up at Lord Arundel, and still had no satisfactory answer to his question. As the adults turned back to their conversation, he contented himself with watching the people below him. Father was still holding him, which Ferdinand saw as permission for him to sit on the parapet. At least he actually had a better view now. The people in the lower part of the auditorium seemed to be in a wild jumble. They all had different clothes on. Some even came in simple street clothes. Were they commoners? Were they allowed to be here just like that? Father had never taken Ferdinand to events like this one before. The boy had ever only had contact with other nobles. He had seen a few of them, mainly in the other galleries along the wall of the hall. Ferdinand paid them no further attention, and marveled at the people below him. They looked so normal. When Father talked about them, Ferdinand had always had the impression that commoners were all poor, and their clothes were tattered and dirty. But these people were nothing like that at all. Ferdinand even envied them. Their clothes looked much more comfortable than his own suit. "Ferdinand, say hello to Marquis Vestra and Hubert." Father lifted Ferdinand from the parapet and set him down in front of him. Ferdinand fidgeted. He wanted to keep watching people. But then he saw the new arrivals and greeted them politely. He knew Hubert from before. Their fathers had dealings with each other from time to time. "Hello," said Ferdinand, grinning broadly. Maybe it wasn't going to be so boring today after all. "Hello," replied Hubert, less enthusiastically. As always, he pulled a flappy face. Ferdinand knew what that meant from his friend, and didn't let it put him off. "Have you seen all the commoners down there?" Ferdinand asked the other boy excitedly. Hubert shrugged his shoulders. "Father says I shouldn't pay any more attention to them." "You really must have a look," said Ferdinand. "They're really exciting." He grabbed Hubert by the hand and dragged him to the parapet. Now, both boys stretched to get a glimpse of the people, but they were both too small to climb onto the parapet. "Hubert, my boy, come here," said Marquis Vestra. "Sit down. It's about to start." Hubert made a grumpy sound. "Yes, Father." "Geez," Ferdinand complained, just when it was starting to get fun. "Ferdinand, that goes for you too," Father echoed. "You can sit on my lap if you keep still." Ferdinand grumbled, but obeyed and went to his father. Father picked him up and sat him on his lap. At least Ferdinand could see better now. The others in the gallery also sat down on their chairs. Lord Arundel leaned forward so that he could speak quietly to Father. What about Count Burghley's? Has he made a decision in the meantime? Marquis Vestra tilted towards them. "Having the Minister of Military Affairs on our side would give us a decisive advantage against the Emperor. Then we take away his troops, his last means of taking action against us." "I know," Father said in an urgent tone. "I'm working on it, but I think I'm starting to soften him up. I'm sure he'll agree to our plan very soon. Then we'll have the Emperor in our hands, not only politically, but also militarily." "Where is Count Hevering, anyway?" asked Marquis Vestra. "Wasn't he supposed to come today?" Ferdinand had to stop himself from fidgeting. He was bored. These adult conversations made no sense to him, and he didn't want to be interested in them. Father had told Ferdinand to be quiet, and now he was talking himself. Fortunately for him, however, a gong was struck at that moment. The noise in the hall died down. Conversations fell silent. Clothes rustled here and there. Someone coughed. A shamisen was struck. Kiyoshigi echoed through the hall. The voice of a narrator rang out. Here we see the story of Yoshitsune and the 1,000 cherry trees who put an end to the false shogun, his own brother, and brought the treacherous samurai of the Taira clan to justice. Admire his courage and loyalty, and marvel at the unrivaled swordsmanship. Enemies will tremble at the sight of him, and the oppressed will shout his name in jubilation, and Yoshitsune will go down in history forever. A fine example for us to follow, Father said to Lord Arundel with a whisper. Lord Arundel nodded and said nothing. Ferdinand stretched his head to get a better view of what was going on up on stage. The curtain was lifted to reveal a palace scene and several figures in sweeping, colorful robes. Their faces were painted in a funny way, Ferdinand thought, white with colorful lines that exaggerated their expressions. Their gestures were just as exaggerated, sweeping and expressive, and the way they spoke seemed strange to Ferdinand. Everything about it was so exaggerated and unusual that he had to stop himself from laughing. It looked so funny. He paid little attention to what was being said. It seemed rather boring. The costumes were much more fascinating. Ferdinand was amazed by the variety of shapes, colors, and fabrics. Could he have a costume like that? It would certainly be fun. Unfortunately, even that quickly became boring, and Ferdinand now had serious problems sitting still. If he started fidgeting now, he would no longer be allowed to sit on his father's lap, and would hardly see anything again, and that was even more boring. So he only wiggled his legs a little, even though he had the urge to jump up and explore the gallery further. He squinted at Hubert. The other boy was plucking at the threads of the embroidery on his robe, and looked just as bored as Ferdinand felt. There was a loud bang and an exclamation. Ferdinand craned his neck. A warrior entered the Hanamichi. He was armed for war, armed with a bow and a huge katana. Ferdinand knew swords, but he had never seen one this big. He was immediately back to full attention. With sweeping strides, the warrior walked across the Hanamichi. The heads of the audience turned towards him, all eyes following him. The warrior announced himself as Minamoto no Yoshitsune, in a voice that echoed far and wide and challenged his enemies to a fight. It was a voice that made Ferdinand realize something else. Dad! That's a woman! He turned to his father and tugged excitedly at his jacket. Shh, boy! You're disturbing the others. Dad reprimanded him with a hushed voice. Yes, the leading lady is a woman. That's Manuela Casagranda. Wow! Wide-eyed, Ferdinand turned round again and watched the action on stage. Manuela, in the role of Yoshitsune, charged towards his enemies and challenged them to a duel. With a dexterity that bordered on magic, Yoshitsune swung the huge sword as if it were no heavier than a feather. The blade whirled around artfully, deflecting the blows of the enemies, bringing them down and cutting off their heads. Dad! Whispered Ferdinand in horror as he saw the blood splattering. Father patted his head reassuringly. It's just red cloth and dolls' heads. Oh! Ferdinand breathed a sigh of relief. Meanwhile, Yoshitsune strode through the ranks of his enemies like a dancer. They fell on all sides, felled by his sword, for no one could match his skill. Ferdinand watched the action as if spellbound. He had already received swords lessons, and his father had assigned a teacher to teach him. So far, his experience had mainly been annoying, having been beaten so often, and found little pleasure in it. However, what Manuela performed here as Yoshitsune was art. Not that Ferdinand knew much about art, but what he saw here was far more than just rough chopping and beating. It was flowing movements, like water, a body as malleable as air, a sword as an extension of the arm, far more than just a tool. Ferdinand watched, mesmerized. If swordplay was far more than just bluntly waving steel around in his hand, if swordplay could also be this, then he wanted to learn it. He wanted to become like Manuela, in complete control of his body and his surroundings. Nothing would ever come close to him again. No one would be able to penetrate his defenses. And he would look good, too. Father always said that as a nobleman, their function was to be a role model for their subjects. In Manuela, Ferdinand saw the perfect embodiment of this ideal for the first time. An ideal he really wanted to achieve for the first time. Perhaps theater wasn't as stupid as he had thought it was this morning. The end. Thank you for listening.